I think it's very important to understand right away why the BBC is the focus of this meeting in a way. This isn't a meeting about Israel and Palestine. This isn't even a meeting bashing the BBC in general. I'm a great admirer of the BBC. But on this one most persistent crisis in foreign affairs that we've faced in the world, probably, most persistent crisis since the end of the Second World War, the Israel-Palestine issue, the BBC at the moment, which we all pay for, which we are taxed to pay for, which has a public broadcasting remit to tell the truth and to be fair, on this particular crisis, the BBC is failing to tell us the proper truth. It is failing to tell us the story. It is a critical moment for the BBC in that if it isn't going to tell the truth about this, can we really believe that it's telling the truth about everything else? When Greg Philo wrote his first book, the first edition of this book in 2004, it was in response to much criticism which many of us had made in various forums, many journalists like myself who'd worked in the Middle East, many people who knew about the Middle East, who'd watched the BBC's, and I'm talking about the BBC, ITV is just as guilty, but the BBC matters because of its influence and it's the fact that we pay for it, and it has responsibilities laid out in a royal charter. Greg's first book came out in 2004 based on the coverage of the Aqsa Intifada, which had broken out at the end of 2000, and the Israelis had responded to in a very violent way. There was violence on both sides, but the Israelis had started to use the weapons of war. Greg's book put bones in 2004 on the opinions and observations that a lot of us experts had made, but he brought to the case analysis, a scientific analysis, and of course talked to the people, as he's told us just now, talked to the, as it were, the victims of this coverage, and showed without any doubt at all that the public was being misled, was not getting a clear idea of why there was this terrible crisis between Israel and Palestine, that one side of the story was being told in a certain way, a certain emphatic and convincing way, the other side of the story was hardly being told at all. As a result of that book and of many complaints, the BBC in 2005, the governors of the BBC, which still existed then, set up something called an impartiality commission, which interviewed everybody. It interviewed Israelis, it interviewed pro-Israelis, it interviewed Arabs, it interviewed journalists, it interviewed experts, academics, you name it. It even interviewed me. And it took an enormous amount of evidence. It interviewed Greg, of course. And this commission, which was impartial, there were no Arabs on it, there were no Israelis on it, there were no pro-Israelis, there were no pro-Palestinians. It's completely impartial, as near as you can get to a completely impartial commission. This commission came up with the view that the BBC indeed had not told the fair story. It was misleading the public. It couched it in slightly more mellifluous words than perhaps I would, or perhaps even Greg would. But nevertheless, the message was quite clear. And in 2006, the BBC did, to some extent, respond to this by appointing a Middle East editor called Jeremy Bowen, and by putting a correspondent on the West Bank, though it was a very junior correspondent. 5 years on, it's evident that that commission's findings have been completely ignored, the thrust of them, trying to find a fair balance. When this commission sat, it was still possible for people like me and others like me who were concerned about this issue to speak to the BBC. We had meetings with executives. We had meetings with news people. I went into Television Centre myself and talked to then bosses of television news. We had meetings with the editors of television news. We had meetings with all sorts of people. There was a sort of dialogue. It may have been a dialogue of the deaf, but at least there was a dialogue. Since then, since 2006 and the commission, and I think probably about since the time of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the BBC has started to build an iron wall around itself, in which it is almost impossible now to raise any of these important issues that Greg has raised in his book so eloquently and so pointedly. It is impossible to raise with the BBC any of these issues. Phone calls are not answered, emails are not answered, telephone calls are not answered. I myself filed a complaint about the way the Israeli settlements are described by the BBC, which is inadequate. And I filed chapter and verse, I think it was 6 weeks ago. After I filed it through email, through the official channel, I sent emails to all the people I know in the BBC, and 3 of whom I'd worked with in my time. Not a word, no response, not even an acknowledgement that the complaint had been made. I still, by the way, 6 weeks later, have had no acknowledgement, no reply. I mentioned it again in a piece I wrote in The Guardian today, a big piece about Greg's book, which details this, and I recommend you to read it, not because I wrote it, but because it sets out in quite simple printed form what I'm talking about the BBC's iron wall. And there is also a response from the BBC which tries to smear me at the end, which has totally backfired, and I've had such response about this. But it shows how beleaguered the BBC is and how frightened it is to enter any kind of realistic debate. The Mavi Marmara affair, which Victoria mentioned, is a case in point. We finally did, after many, many complaints. There were 2,000 contacts with the BBC, which is a phenomenal amount over this one program. 72% of those complaints, 72% of those contacts were complaints about the nature of the program. And finally, after much shiftiness and deflection and dodging and legalizing and prevaricating, the BBC came up with a report which I must say is one of the most tendentious pieces of garbage I've ever read in my life. I spent this weekend reading. It's 50,000 words long. It's like a novella, and reading it, one just keeps yelling out. I mean, only three very crucial complaints were upheld. One of which was this, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but this will give you a flavor of the sort of response you get from the BBC when you finally do get through past this iron curtain, over this iron wall of resistance the BBC has built up. One of the points upheld was the complaint that, and they upheld this on a point of, there are 2 ways you can get your complaint through: accuracy or impartiality. This complaint was upheld on the grounds of accuracy. And this was basically, I'm paraphrasing, that autopsy evidence on the victims, showing that victims may have been executed, shot in the back or shot in the head, was not used, though this was not held to prejudice impartiality. So, one key piece of evidence that could have suggested that the Israelis killed, injured, and/or defenseless people is left out of the equation. But this does not affect impartiality. Yet the whole thrust and innuendo of the program, much of it based on Israeli evidence, by the way, was that sinister, violent Islamist forces lay in wait upon this aid ship to spring a trap on these unsuspecting commandos, abseiling from their helicopter, innocently, just trying to stop a ship. Panorama's agenda was said to be counterintuitive. That's the way it was described. And most of the exonerations in this judgment, one tendentious judgment which picks out in the most odd way little bits and pieces of Panorama's answer to these very basic criticisms and finds for them. I mean, it's an intriguing exercise to go through, but I won't bore you with it. But most of the exonerations in this judgment appear to sympathize with this view that's counterintuitive, right? Yet of 2,000, I said, nearly 3/4 of the people who complained about this program, and many of us who examined this BBC final judgment, took the program to be one whose effect, if not purpose, was by innuendo and lack of corrective context. This is the important thing through all the coverage. It's about context. This lack of corrective context, all this innuendo, was to portray the Israeli attack on a civilian merchant ship as in some way justifiable. It was not, in effect, a piece of pro-Israeli journalism on the BBC, but it must have gladdened the hearts of the Israeli authorities, and they didn't even have to pay for it. there were nothing but contentious judgments throughout this panorama judgment. And I recommend anybody who's got the time or inclination. But I mean, the cheekiest bit of this judgment was at the end. I mean, even the last paragraph, it's full of self-contradiction. For instance, it ends up by saying, the committee noted too those occasions where it had decided the editorial guidelines had not been breached, but get this, but where the viewer could have been better served. Occasionally, the content was not as clear as it might have been. Remember that. Collectively, these were flaws which meant that in parts, the program did not fully comply with the BBC's editorial standards. However, the committee, you see, it goes on, it's all like this, it's all like this. This is very bad, this is very bad, but however, the committee concluded, and this is the highest court of appeal in the BBC, the committee concluded that Death in the Med was an original, illuminating, and well-researched piece of journalism. Well, that is a contortionist speaking. I don't know how much time I've got left, but I think it's worthwhile pointing out that when I worked for the BBC, I must say, as Middle East correspondent in Palestine and Israel, as well as mostly in other parts of the Arab world, I never had any interference of this sort. I never was stopped from writing what I saw. And I saw many very bad things, both in the Arab world and in Israel and in Palestine. There was no, I can only remember one or two occasions when somebody got a bit nervous, but I mean, this happens in journalism, but there was no such atmosphere in the BBC then. And when I worked for the BBC as a freelance during the 1990s up until about 2000, the same sort of atmosphere prevailed, although I noticed certain indications of nervousness after Tony Blair came to power. I suspect that the situation at the BBC changed for 2 or 3 very major reasons. Number one, the Israelis mounted a massive new propaganda campaign in the year 2000 when they knew that the Aqsa Intifada was coming, and they knew that they might, if they got things wrong, suffer the same disastrous public relations and press that they did after Sabra Shatila in 1982, after the after the first Intifada in 1987 to 1992, and they could see that the Oslo Accords were going very badly wrong in public opinion and that something was coming down the line. The Israelis spent massive amount on propaganda in this town. They invented a new organization called Bicon with a £1 million budget, and they've put that to very good effect at all levels of the BBC. The second thing was the way the Israelis were very quick to co-opt the terror of 9/11 and to make it a blanket thing that terror meant Arab, Arab meant Palestinian, and they confused the 3 issues, and the BBC got very nervous about that. Then there was the Hutton inquiry, where the BBC was kicked in the knackers very hard, lost its director general, lost its chairman, and that was a disastrous blow. And the BBC then realized that the politicians, that you couldn't fool around with the politicians. They became very nervous about that. I think those were 3 main reasons, but there are many others, that the BBC changed in the last 10 years, and it's getting worse. And this is a crisis, and we must think, I think, finally, about a campaign to make sure that the BBC, much as I admire it, no longer is its own final judge and final arbiter on the question of its own editorial policy. ITV and Sky and the others have to answer to Ofcom, an outside body. It's about time the BBC was made to answer to an independent body and not make up its own rules and be its own judge, jury, and executioner.